Hi y'all, so this is our first lecture in Unit 2. It's called Biodiversity Basics, and we're going to go over really what is biodiversity, how do we measure it. So, what is the most common animal in the world? What do you think? Take a guess. And I'm saying most common animal. It is nematode roundworms. These make up 4 out of 5 animals on the entire Earth. They're typically pretty small. Okay, what about this? What is the most common organism in the world? What do you think? Broadening it up to organism. Have you made your guess? Here's the answer. It's a bacteria. Don't forget that bacteria are living, right? This bacteria is called Pelagibacter ubique, and it's a bacteria in the ocean. The ocean is very big. Cool. So when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about the variety of life in a particular area. Now, we can very easily see if something is diverse, but there are also other ways that we can calculate it and measure it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be going from smallest scale to biggest scale, and we're going to talk about 3 different types of biodiversities and how we measure them. So the first one is genetic diversity. So this is actually looking at the genes and the DNA and figuring out how diverse are the genes among the individuals in a population, right? So here's an example. We're looking at a global map of indigenous skin color. What do you notice about this map? What do you see? What are the trends that you're looking at? Well, you might see darker colors toward the center where it might be the equator. Then they get lighter and lighter, but they kind of have these lines straight across. Right? Does this look familiar? Does this map distribution look familiar? It's kind of similar to how biomes are distributed, right? Like they follow latitudes. You get different ones as you go along. Here's the thing that we fight over so much, and the thing that has caused racism and perpetuated racism and has become the reason for racism is really just an adaptation, right? All it is our natural pigment in our skin tone that is helping us prevent against the sun's harmful UV rays. And this developed many years ago, and is actually a great thing because it protects us from, again, those harmful UV rays. And yet this is the thing that we're fighting over, y'all. This is the thing. It does not even make up that much of our genetic code. It is a good adaptation, and here we are today, 2020, still fighting over it. Right. Number 2, so the second type of diversity that I want to talk about is species diversity. So like it sounds, it's basically the number of species in a region or habitat, and we can kind of figure that out by counting them, or we can figure out different types of ratios between the number of species. Right, and the third type of diversity as we get bigger in scale is habitat diversity. So not just the genes and not just the individual species, but now we're looking at kind of ecosystems as a whole. And what are the different ecosystems, what are the different habitats that can be provided in a particular region? California is super neat because we have so many different habitats and ecosystems. That's why a lot of people love living here, right? You can live in one place and drive a few hours to the mountains, drive a few hours to the beach, drive a few hours to forests, things like that. All right, so how do we calculate these specific types of diversities? For genetic diversity, when we're looking at the genes, we really are kind of looking at the variety within the DNA that we can get. So we would have to genotype them, look at the specific DNA. Quick note, genes change over time naturally, right? This is through natural selection, adaptations, mutations, all of that stuff. That happens over time, and that can take a really long time. However, there are ways that genetic diversity can change very quickly. one example of this is called the bottleneck effect. So what happens here is you have this original population. So imagine all of the blue and red colored dots are organisms, right, that have a specific trait. Something might happen. Let's say a huge fire happens, California, right? And then we've got a huge reduction in the population. Let's say a bunch of the population gets wiped out in the fire. And this is what happens. These are the surviving individuals that are left. You see a lot of red dots and fewer blue dots. So what ends up happening, the overall population changes to have more red dots than the original population because of this huge event, right? So this is something that is called the bottleneck effect and can change genetic diversity very quickly. All right, in terms of species diversity, this is the one that's probably calculated most often. You can either calculate the different number of species or you can calculate the ratio of species. So we're going to talk about this. It's called species richness and species evenness. So let's take a look here. Before we do that, don't forget, what is a species? A species can interbreed and produce viable offspring. They have to be able to produce viable offspring who are also fertile, right? In terms of species that we have cataloged, or I should say scientists have cataloged, we estimate that there are about 2 million different species that we've identified and kind of written down. But in actuality, there are probably somewhere between 5 million and 100 million different species on Earth. And we don't have a better estimate than that because there are so many that we could not have seen, found, have not discovered yet. Right. The most common estimate for the number of actual species on Earth is about 10 million. So even then, we've categorized 2 million out of the 10 million. Cool. Species richness versus evenness. So species richness is literally counting the total number of different species. Right. Species evenness, so think like, is it even, is it balanced? That's a ratio. So we're deciding how many of each species there are and like, is that balanced in terms of how many there are compared to the rest. So if we take a look at this example here, they both have the same species richness, right? If I counted the number of different species, we've got 4 different trees in each. So that means they have the same species richness. But which one is more even? Which one has a better ratio that is more similar? Community 1 has approximately the same number of each tree, whereas community 2 has a lot of that light colored tree, right? So we would say that community 1 has a higher species evenness. So we would say that it has more diversity in terms of the community. Well, same thing here. I went ahead and I circled. There are 4 different species of mushrooms in community A and 4 different species in community B. So their species richness is the same, 4 and 4. But when we look at it, which one is more even? Community B has a higher species evenness. Cool. Quick side note, there are a lot of different ways to calculate species diversity, and here is another example that you might hear about. This is called the Shannon Diversity Index, and it's basically, it takes the idea of species evenness and it puts it into a formula, and once you calculate the formula, the lower the number, the lower the biodiversity, versus the higher the number, the higher the diversity. I linked in the presentation an awesome YouTube video that can help you calculate Shannon diversity if you are interested. Great. In terms of habitat diversity, we can count kind of the number of different niches that they have, the different number of trophic levels, other ecological processes. So in this picture here, you see that there's a lot of different habitats that can be used by different organisms because they provide different things. Remember, we talked about ecological roles and niches being very different. And if they overlap, then competition happens, which is why habitat diversity is really great. Great. And one of the last few things here, when we're talking about habitat diversity, we also have to consider, can species live there or not, right? And some organisms can survive in many different environments and many different habitats, and other organisms are pretty limited to where they can live. The ones that live in a wide range are called generalist species. They can often eat lots of different things. Their ecological niche is probably way bigger, and they have a wider range than what's called a specialist species. These types of species live in like very narrow conditions. So with that being said, do you think generalists or specialists would be able to survive changes better? Let's say there was a big natural disaster, like a fire or an earthquake, or even, climate change, right? What type of species do you think would survive better in that case? Well, thinking about what they need, generalists would probably be better at surviving, right? If one thing goes away, they have lots of other different options, versus specialists are like, they need this one thing, and if it's gone, then it's gone, and they cannot really move on and use other things, right? So as we move on, think about that and how different species may react to different changes in the environment. So we're going to continue next time around looking at ecosystem changes. But for now, go ahead and have these notes done. There is no interactive for this, so don't mind what that says on there, but make sure you turn in your notes on Google Classroom. Awesome.